Hello and welcome to today's featured webinar, 10 Worst Practices Using Veeam Backup and Replication. My name's Rick Vanover. I'm Senior Director of Product Strategy here at Veeam. I'm going to be one of your presenters today. And I'm joined also by Travis Miller. How are you doing, Travis?
I'm doing very well, thank you, Rick.
And for our attendees, we have a very, very good crowd. Welcome to all of you. Let's go ahead and get started. I have 3 small administrative points about the webinar that I'd like to cover. The first is you're automatically muted on entry, but that doesn't mean you can't participate. So that if you have a question, use the GoToWebinar chat or question and answer panel, and we will do our best to answer your question. Now, this webinar is being recorded, and you are going to get a link to replay that webinar as well as download these slides. That's going to be sent to the email in which you've registered. Now, I also want to offer one other small point. This week, we sent an email with a bad certificate promoting the webinar, and it came on behalf of me. I didn't actually send it, but I just wanted to apologize to any of you who got that email with the certificate warning and such. Okay, well, before we get into the top 10, or the worst 10, as it were, I want to just do a quick introduction of Veeam. What I want you to know is that we release products and capabilities very often, and this is a list of what we challenge are some of the industry firsts, things that have changed the backup market. And if you've been with Veeam for a while, you know that innovative things come out, different things come into market. And if you say yes to Veeam, you're going to have a good way with that. We get that done through 4 main areas: virtual, physical, software as a service, and cloud workloads. Now, most of what we're going to talk about here today aligns to virtual and physical. That's because we have 11 years of best and worst practices to go along with the product. And when we think about backup and restore, replication and failover, and all the other things around orchestration, APIs, and monitoring that we want to do with our environments, we have to get those first things first right. So the backups, the replications, that's where we're going to spend most of our time today. And as a company, we have been growing. This is my 9th year here at Veeam, and it's a global company, over 350,000 customers worldwide, a plus 73 net promoter score, and wherever you are in the world, chances are there's a Veeam market that's doing well. Okay, so enough of the introduction. Again, welcome. I want to kind of answer a question. Why am I talking about worst practices? Well, Travis and I have collaborated on this, and we kind of thought it's really important to get people started in the right direction earlier. And every time I talk to customers in the field, I say, why would you do it that way? And did you know you could do it this way? Those types of things. And to be fair, I spend my whole day thinking about backups. Not everybody does. I realize you have a many other set of responsibilities and other technologies that you need to work with. And Travis, you have an interesting perspective on this. What's your motivation to share some of the worst practices?
Thank you, Rick. Mine comes from a different standpoint because I came over from support. I've worked with Veeam for several years now, and I've seen everything under the sun, it appears. So something somebody does, it just kind of stands out, and you're going, well, okay, it might work for somebody else, but a lot of people that might not really work for, and just learning from those that get everybody off to the right start.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Anything we can do to bring some information forward to you, that's the logic here. And I think that's a great trend, Travis. We should always have marketing people start in support to bring some of the common sense knowledge out. I think the market would agree. Now, this topic is not entirely our own. In fact, this is the EMEA webinar. Edwin Wejema has presented this topic at VeeamON in Miami. Now, you can actually replay this topic he presented at veeamon.com, but if you have done that, you'll notice his topic is top 7. And then if you were to actually score the top 7 versus our top 10, you'll see that the lists actually became different, right? So we removed some and added some new ones, and Edwin's first 7, but this content isn't exclusively our own content. And big thanks to Edwin, which you can follow him socially down there at Viperion and at vmguru.com. So let's jump into it. Number 10, the worst practice that I want to share first is not taking a backup at all. And the thought is that, sometimes organizations think it's optional, or more specifically, haven't thought about it for all workloads. And this could come into a number of situations, everything from, well, I set up my backups and then I went on to work on other things. But the reality is new virtual machines are added every day. So of course, if you've already set up your backup, you may run into a situation where you're not backing it up. So I like to flip that around and introduce the best practice. So the best practice is really to use things like tags, especially in VMware environments. In fact, this is the week of VMworld in the US, and I think it was VMworld 2014. Luca DeLoca, who's one of the architects in our cloud team based in EMEA, Luca and I gave a presentation at VMworld about using tags for backups. We did webinars about it, and then Luca wrote also a paper, which you have that short URL right there. And the thought is, even though that's 5 years old, there's a lot of that is absolutely still relevant today. And a simple piece of advice is really to build your backup jobs on containers or other constructs, something like a vSphere tag. Same for System Center, by the way. But the thought here is that I have, in my environment that I work with, I have 4 tags. I have something called Tier 1 4-hour, Tier 1 12-hour, Tier 2 12, or Tier 2 24-hour, and Tier 3 7 days. The thought here is I have some workloads I back up every 4 hours, every 12 hours, every 24 hours, or every 7 days. And as a virtual machine is made, I actually apply that tag. Work backwards, building the backup jobs on those tags can help you make sure nothing is omitted. And then maybe even think about a no backup tag. Apply this that you say, I'm not backing this up, but you've actually done the work to say this does and does not get backed up. And then at the end of the day, you can run Veeam 1 reports to know what is and is not backed up. My number 9 tip is around cutting corners. And this is something that is going to have a more specific recommendation from Travis here in a bit. But the thought here is that you don't want to cut corners around the infrastructure of your backup data. I can't tell you how many times I have seen organizations put in the best, latest and greatest Tier 1 technology for storage and compute platforms. And they select Veeam, so they have a great software decision there. But then when you look at the actual backup storage and backup resources that have been put in place to manage the backup data, like and store it from a performance standpoint, it's really not that good. So I actually like to offer 2 very specific pieces of advice, and there's always more that you can get into it. But the first of those pieces of advice is consider the 3-2-1 rule. The 3-2-1 rule states have 3 different copies of your data on 2 different media, with one of which being off-site. And the thought here is, when we think about 2 different media, well, maybe one of the media can be very high performance, but only carry a little bit of the backup data, like maybe only 7 days. And then maybe another media has 5 years of backup data, but it's not as fast, right? And if I need something from older than 1 week, I can deal with a little bit slower restore times. So things like that. And then my second bullet point here is to put backup storage in place like you want to use it to restore. And I'm being a little bit cheeky here, but the thought here is that why would you put something in if it's not going to do what you want it to do? And we have 2 resources to help you with that. One is the Veeam Ready program, and this is something that's evolved over the years, but basically it has a list of storage devices that are approved for things like instant VM recovery and our data labs and things like that. This is a set of equipment that you're going to have the experience you want to have with it. So I encourage you to check that out. Now, Veeam's very agnostic. We can write on basically any storage, but you're going to have different levels of experience. That's where the Veeam Ready can help you out. And then there's also the Veeam Best Practices Guide that can help you navigate the existing capabilities and what is truly the best practice. And the other thing I'll note about the Best Practice Guide, if you go there now, you'll say, wow, it's not even updated for update 4. Well, the reason is we want every recommendation in there to be field proven for a year or longer. So you'll see it stops and it's not entirely current, but there's a reason for that. Now we can take those recommendations and build on them. So I recommend multiple copies of your data. Here's 3 different ways that you can introduce some of these. I really like snapshot only jobs. Those can be on storage arrays that Veeam has an integration with. And those are a great restore point, basically in the middle of the day, every hour, for example. Great way to handle things like deleted virtual machine or isolated ransomware situations. But you still want to have backups on different media. So that's where that level 1 backup job can build from that. Something to different storage, and I just gave, for example, 24-hour backup job kept for 7 days. If you've used Veeam, you know you can tweak both of those numbers. And then a backup copy job. This is, again, something that'll go to another different media or a different site. This is something that you can also introduce the longer tail of retention. And then tape or air gaps. We're going to come back to that later in our recommendations, but I don't ever want people to kind of omit this because it is a very effective technique for additional risks that are out there today. So on number 8, Travis has an insight here on the 5 Ps.
So this one seems very straightforward and easy. You're thinking, well, why would this be such a bad thing to do? And straight to production is one of those we see very often where a customer comes in, has just disabled their previous backup solution and saying, we need to get this set up right now because I won't have any backups tonight and I just need this right now. And it's like, well, we want to help you, but you didn't take the time to plan it out or do testing. And this goes on to the 5 Ps. Proper planning prevents poor performance. So a lot of times you can get stuck if you're rushing through it to fall victim to several other items on this list alone. And this kind of goes along with what Rick was saying earlier about cutting corners, taking the time to sit down and plan this out. And my best practices for this are in the terms of the test in a dev environment or non-production environment. So that could be just a laptop, another computer, an isolated few virtual machines that aren't high priority to see how it interacts with your environment, how things are going, so you ensure that you're doing everything right and getting used to the software before you go live into full production. Very helpful, and make sure that you get what you want out of the software and get to start using it day 1 compared to running into some stopgaps along the way. So again, you don't want to disable your old solution, or if you don't have another solution, kind of plan accordingly to get the trial or our free community edition, get it installed. Doesn't even mean you have to have purchased it yet, but use the ability to get familiar with the software before it's a full live production software. Now, another one is, again, map out your deployment ahead of time. Take some time planning using a Visio, something along those lines, to have a topology of your different environment and where you're going to deploy components. Again, very straightforward, and something that if you are feeling a little daunted with this, we do offer a Veeam accredited service partner program that we do have partners in your region or area that will be able to assist you with a new setup and configuration when you are ready. So, and if you just have some questions along the way of how something works or anything, we have a great support team that you can open up a case and they'll gladly answer some questions. Now, they won't go in and fully set it up for you, but again, they're that helping hand along the way. So, and
Good stuff. And so another rather big one that's becoming more and more of a consideration here is around security. And we see a lot of organizations that, it's kind of funny. Veeam is a very flexible set of technology for backup software. And I want to say sometimes you can just throw it in, right? There's plenty of small environments that you don't need much work to deploy. But the bigger your environment, or more specifically, the more sensitive your data is that we're backing up, we need to think about this more and more. So some of the worst examples are using domain administrator for everything, every single role, every single use case, every single permission, and interactively using the product as that username. That's a worst practice. And all the components on a flat network interconnected to each other with no firewalling or isolation or segmentation. So that's the worst practice, but I would challenge there's plenty of opportunities to leverage some built-in roles, leverage some required ports, and leverage some required permissions. This might be a good opportunity to get your security admin involved with this. And a little piece of information, it's very well documented, the roles, the ports, and the permissions. And if you've not been to our user guide or the online documentation at helpcenter.veeam.com, you'll really like what you see. In fact, this is actually one of the most popular parts of the website in regards to traffic. So that tells us people are using it, which is great, but we do see a worse practice when people don't. So there's a lot of excuses on how that could be or why. Some people like to say that security is inconvenient, but we encourage you to look at some of these roles. In fact, you might not even know, for example, the second one, Veeam Backup Viewer. This is a great role where they can just look at the console and get details and review past operations. Can't run it. That's the second role, Backup Operator. And then of course there's the Backup Administrator, but then also tape operators and restore operators. Those are other roles that you can roll, pardon the pun, into your security practice. And the thought here is that having these roles are really straightforward. We can add them in the user interface and have multiple roles per user. You can implement some least privilege approach as well as segregation of duties. And this is in addition to some role-based access control for self-service backup and restore. So if you think about all of those from a interactive use context, you can actually implement a lot of security. But that's not all. In fact, one of the things you might want to think about is segmentation. And segmentation just simply means taking some of the different components and placing them on different networks. One of the areas on this diagram, and there's a lot of ways you can diagram this, and not everybody will have all of these services, I fully understand. But one thing I want to highlight is the most important area are some of the backup storages, right? Because at the end of the day, that is the piece of infrastructure that matters most. You want to have the most segmentation, everything from username access, different set of credentials going to this set of resources here, different networking, firewalling, all of those things. This is the area that I recommend above all you put the most effort into, because the backup storage, where those backup files reside, that's the most important part. And you can logically put all of these different zones in the different use cases and have in your environment whatever makes the most sense. Now, the other side of that is that all of the different roles, and we'll talk more about those and components here in a second, they have their own port requirements. Again, that's documented at the website in the Help Center part. But when you look at it this way, this becomes pretty clear that, okay, this is what I need to open, and maybe this needs to be on a different segment, et cetera, et cetera. But then the other thing is we can also get into situations where, well, that doesn't apply. So for example, here's a VMware vCloud Director deployment. Now this might not apply to everybody. So if you're not using it, maybe let's remove access to that particular resource. Same thing with deduplication appliances. There's a gateway role and a gateway service, right? If I'm not using that, then I might want to think about removing those particular sets of ports. Another popular approach are Windows agents and Linux agents. These are other backup softwares, and it's very possible that maybe you want to have a separate Veeam console and a separate Veeam deployment for that. You can keep them consolidated with your virtual machine backups. That's fully fine. But if you want to reduce, layers of interconnectedness, right? You could maybe remove those ports for Windows and remove those ports for Linux, and then basically remove the potential of that area, right? So you can actually always contract the surface area. And if you're not going to do Windows deployments, then maybe we don't need that port for the deployment of agents, right? So then let's remove that, right? So you have all of these different opportunities to remove different surface areas. These are all documented, but if you know which components you want to put in, you can know where you need to contract some of this stuff. Okay, so my sixth tip here is around not having disaster recovery. Now, disaster recovery means a lot of things to a lot of people. Some people say, well, let's just hold our backups and let's keep our backups off site. That is DR. We'll do a lot of restores. Have you timed that? Do you really think that's going to do what you want? Do you know what that will go like? Have you tested it, right? There's a lot of questions that simply come with holding backups off site. And the other side of it is that our product is called Veeam Backup and Replication. So what does it do? It does backups and it does replication. Now, backups are simply one or more systems, virtual machines or agents put into a compressed and deduplicated file. A replication job is one or more virtual machines copied over to a new virtual machine on a restore point interval. And those virtual machines are inventoried and runnable, ready to go. Now, the worst practice is not having a replication angle to your strategy. The best practice is using this engine. In fact, every release, there's always a long list of enhancements to the replication engine. It gets better every year. And some of the actually older capabilities can actually really help you now. One of those is built-in WAN acceleration. Now, built-in WAN acceleration is more like a gateway technology that will allow you to have replications where you might not have thought you could, right? Oh, I don't have the bandwidth for that. But if you combine the WAN acceleration with the next capability, sourcing it from a backup or mapping technologies, none of those are new, but the thought is you can actually introduce the offsite DR where you might not have known it was possible. So sourcing from backups is actually rather awesome. What it does is it will, instead of reading a production virtual machine to write a virtual machine as a replica offsite, it'll read the backup file that we've taken. So it takes that same restore point, and that read IO will be on the backup storage. That read IO will not be on the production virtual machine. The beautiful thing here is that it saves that IO, and then secondly, you presumably have less bandwidth for offsite, so replicas are going to take longer than a backup. It's the same amount of changed block tracking data that goes from a backup or a replica job, but if we have less bandwidth to get to the target, it's going to take a little bit longer. But that's actually not a problem if we're reading it from the backup file. We don't keep our production virtual machine snapshot open very long. It's just the backup window versus a replica might keep that open a very long time. This engine's improved over the years with every release, and then you also have some data lab capabilities to test on the other end that can really help you. And the last part of the best practice is to consider Veeam Availability Orchestrator. And this will take that top level of systems that you need to have disaster recovery for, and that'll orchestrate the recovery offsite. Anyways, that's one of the most important sets of the product is the other half, the replication engine. And if you're not using that for disaster recovery, you can definitely check it out. So let's turn this over to number 5 here with Travis. And Travis, I got a note that we lost audio. Hopefully you did not lose my audio, and hopefully I can hear you.
I can hear you. I think, I don't know. Hopefully everybody else is not having any issues with their audio at this time. Um, are you able to hear me, Rick?
Yeah, I'm
Okay.
able to hear you. I'm going to see if I can get Neil sorted out. Carry on with number 5.
Good. Everybody else saying it's good. So, okay, so we'll move right along. So, not validating backups. That's one of our major ones that we see. Yes, you've backed it up, you've replicated the virtual machine, but have you tested that? Do you know that when the time comes, you're going to be able to restore that data? And I like to say is, sure, backup saves the day. I've heard that multiple times for several customers over the years. Time spent testing now, data and time saved later. Something that when the crunch time comes and you find out that your backups might there, you're scrambling maybe for you do have a tape backup and you have to call that in and you're rushing to get that back on site. Where if you're using something like our Sure Backup Data Labs, which is one of our best practices, is very efficient in testing your backups in place from the restore point. So we leverage a couple of our existing technologies and we will be able to mount the restore point from the compressed deduplicated file directly to your virtual environment. Now, we run it on the shell of it and we leverage it with our vPower NFS service, a proprietary thing that no one else really has. So it's something that we can dive in. And I keep on saying Sure Backup, but with Rick saying replicas and DR situations, we also have what we call a Sure Replica job, set up pretty much the exact same way, but you can boot the replica in place in an isolated environment to protect the rest of your production environment, but then to do the test needing to verify to make sure everything works. Another one of my best practices is testing your DR plan regularly. It doesn't have to be every single day or, once a week, but once a quarter is very nicely, or at least once a year. Setting the time aside to ensure is going through a real life situation. Okay, what's going to happen is we always like to use in support is the smoking crater scenario. If you have a DR situation, what will you do and how are you going to go through this? And when that time comes, are your backups ready to be protected and actually able to restore? Because it's not always the backup solution that has a problem. It might be the actual virtual machine or something from the underlying operating system that had a problem when you backed it up. So when that comes around, you will know ahead of time and know to rectify it when you're doing your actual just backup thing. Another one is enable the health checks. This one can be varying by your infrastructure. So I always recommend people is testing this out, enabling it on a job or two, seeing if it does increase your backup window more. But it is a very helpful tool to be on the fly. And if it does recognize corrupted block, it will actually go back and heal and re-pull that data block from the production and then reestablish it in the existing restore point. So very helpful tools there. On this next slide, we'll dive into a little bit more into the actual Sure Backup and data labs. So this is a overview of kind of what goes down when you are launching a Sure Backup job. Again, I said it starts in an isolated environment in the virtual lab. It boots directly from the compressed backup file and leveraging the vPower NFS. So then you can also enable a virus scan or malware scan. So when it is booted in this isolated environment, to verify the data is on there so you don't reinfect your production if you are going to move it back in there. So, and that's used with our stage restore or just in normal testing, you can have this done. So we're just adding features every release usually with Data Labs to improve its capabilities. Another thing is the test that we do. So when it does boot, we do a heartbeat test, we do a ping test. Then we have standardized application tests. So we have a DC test, we have a exchange test, and a SQL test. So when we do those, for SQL example, we will actually enumerate the backup files and or the databases and verify that the service is running. And the nice thing is that's just our predefined test. Now we do give you the opportunity as well to choose any other tests that you want to do, but you will have to build a script yourself. And if you're like me is going, well, I don't know how to really build a script for that, we do have a very strong forums support with this, where there's a community of existing customers like yourself or new customers that would want to learn how to do this and share scripts along the way. So if you have a very specialized software or application, you can go in and at the end of this, you can actually test that application to make sure it booted properly, the machine's up and running, and you can do multiple machines at once within an application group, so how they interact. So you're rebuilding your production environment in an isolated environment, but not utilizing much space. This saves you a lot of space, and it's using a portion of your repository server with the vPower NFS, and then allocating and just running the virtual machine on a snapshot in your isolated environment. This is another time where we do recommend using, in a lot of cases, you can set this up to use the daisy chain method for our backup jobs. So you have the backup job kick off at, let's say, 7 p.m. and it ends at 9. Immediately when it's done, you will take the Sure Backup job, will boot that restore point into the recovery isolated environment and verify and do the standardized checks or the more advanced checks if you like, and make sure that, well, now we set aside that restore point, hey, I know it should be good to go. And you can do this at any interval. So you could do it once a week, once a month on a backup chain as well. Or just go through and cascade through your jobs. Do one job a day and the next day do another job. So there's a lot of capabilities and flexibility with this. So, and at the end of it, the nice thing is it will clean it up and just move along and leave nothing behind, and then send you a nice tidy report for compliance saying, hey, I tested my backups. I know if we have a problem tomorrow, these backups are good to go. Well, on to you here, Rick.
Good stuff. And our number 4 tip is around these components, not distributing them enough. Now, the reality is you can throw Veeam in all on one system, but the reality is that might not always be the best. Now, I'll put a disclaimer here. If you're a small environment, this is not necessarily so important. But if you are running like a retail environment, where you have like a remote office, branch office, retail facility, you probably do want to distribute the components. But if you are doing a major data center design, the one thing I would not do is keep everything on one system. So my worst practice is seeing larger deployments in centralized data centers where this one monster system does it all. Now, the problem of that is you might not be getting the performance you could. And then secondly, it becomes kind of a beast to administer this one ginormous system. So my best practice here is to identify components and distribute accordingly. So how we can look at that is really kind of visually. If we take an all-in-one installation, so we have a number of roles, and there's actually more roles than this, but the backup server, which is where we install, the backup repository, which is where we put our backups. There's a proxy, which is a data mover. There's a database, which powers everything that happens previously. And there are a couple of services: distribution service, broker service, and vPower NFS service. Now, if you just installed Veeam, especially in VMware environments, this is what you'd be dealing with. And there's a documented set of processor, memory, disk, and network requirements. But what we can do is actually decouple these. In fact, this is something that's been improved every release since around version 6. We can actually pull the console out. Now, this actually works for our point around security. I actually do remote console all the time in my environment. Another thing we can pull out is the database. So the databases here, that's a service that, especially if you're a larger environment, you might want to use SQL Server Standard versus the Express. And you could leverage an existing centralized database resource. And then aside from the database, the next thing that you might want to decouple is the proxy. Now, the proxy is probably one of the most important components in the mix, and it is the data mover. It has compute and connectivity to do the work on behalf of the job. So one of the things that's really nice about the proxy is they're sizable, right? They have requirements, and Travis will talk about that here in a second. But if you need more, well, that's no problem. Let's add another proxy. And one more situation is that if you have these proxies and even that's not enough, you can add yet another. It's very scale out, and all of the work will go out and be on behalf of the console through those proxies. And one little tip here is, especially in VMware environments, you can make physical proxies in the mix. I really like this. This is the busy part of the backup job. And then if they're a physical system, all of that compute spike is not in your VMware environment. So it's not going to skew your DRS. A little tip there. And then the other thing we can decouple is the repository. That's the backup storage. And the repository, as well as the different services that go along with them, if we start moving those around, we can actually have much more manageable components that both from a security perspective, from a performance perspective, can give you a much more efficient design. And the one thing I'll highlight here is that we also have, I recommend actually every backup environment use the scale out backup repository because it's a software defined backup storage approach. Last month, or maybe the month before, I did a webinar explicitly on this topic and only on this topic. So I encourage you to check that out if you haven't. And then when we look at these components, this is a environment that has a little bit of everything. And if you can look at some of the components being decoupled and how you can design them, you can walk into a situation where you can have really good flow, both management and data collection. And in this situation, you'll see that there's good clean flow between these components, the source data, and the targets. So this is a really interesting way to visualize it. And again, it depends on your environment. But the thought here is that the management and the data flow are two separate communication paths. And if you think about these requirements, ports, permissions, you can build a wonderful environment. And if you flip this around to a multi-site view, you can take some of the same view. And this actually blurs both site A, site B for enterprises at the top. And then on the bottom, this would also introduce basically the service provider type of design, which could also be a service provider enterprise implementation. But the thought here is management, data collection, site to site, replication jobs, backup jobs. You can walk into a pretty granular design. So number 3, let's talk about some of the resources of these components.
Thank you, Rick. So with this one, and as he was showing on some of these, and as you expand them out, and some, like you said, some situations, one machine can handle it all, but that's usually when you do have a smaller environment. But once you start scaling up, you do want to spread these things out because we do have that nice handy list of system requirements. But one thing you always got to keep in mind, when you have a server that's a backup server, the repository and proxy, you have to allocate separately for each and then stack those on one another. So it can be done, but you got to keep that in mind of utilizing so they play nice. And with this one, we're going to go over kind of roughly how much RAM and CPU do our proxy and repositories standardly need, and then kind of the backup console as well. Veeam uses what we call a resource scheduling tool. Now, this will interact with our Veeam backup service. When a job or task runs, it communicates with this service and then informs it of what resources it needs. The service analyzes the job settings, the backup infrastructure components, and the current load on the components, and automatically allocates that optimal resources. Now, that sounds very nice and everything, and it is a very powerful and helpful tool, but if you don't give it enough resources in the first place, it can't properly allocate all those resources. So if you only have 2 gigs of RAM on that machine and it's utilizing one of that for Windows, you only have 1 gig left when it might want to use 3 or 4. So something you have to always keep in the back of your mind. This is for our help center guide and everything else. And this is our kind of brief overview. Then underneath it, there's a section on this next slide I'll show you that's called limitation of concurrent tasks. Rick, if you, thank you. Now, this is showing you on a very kind of snapshot of a certain situation, but you can use this address and apply to your environment and with scaling opportunities. So on the left here, we have a virtual machine that has 3 virtual disks. And then we have our proxy server. Then we have a repository server and another repository server. I did leave the console out of this, but let's assume that this is a separate console server. Now that's where if the database was still locally there, but it's a management one. And the nice thing is this could be completely off-site from where your console server is and keeping all the bandwidth and traffic there other than a couple API calls isolated to that environment. So this is a good reason of why to break them out and keep them separate from each other is if you have multiple satellite locations. Now with this one, we do it for concurrent tasks. So a task is one virtual hard disk. So in this example, we have a virtual machine, we leverage our parallel processing. The proxy is reading all 3 disks at the same time, and then it has to write those 3 tasks to the repository. So the repository will also be using 3 tasks. Our common rule of thumb here is 1 task equals 1 CPU core. So, and then roughly you want to always have 2 gigs of RAM per CPU core. So, and with this one, we have 3 CPU cores and 6 gigs of RAM. This can process everything in parallel. Now, if I had my repository only with 2 CPU cores and a couple gigs of RAM, and it had it set to this, it would only be able to process 2 of those. So it's always the lesser of the 2. So your repository and proxy, you always want to make sure they're within the same realm. And a lot of times you want to actually, in this example, if you're using the 321 and the backup copy job or something else that's doing a read operation, sure backup at the time or something like that, does obtain a task from the repository server while we're doing a read operation. So that's why with this one, we have 6 CPU cores and 12 gigs of RAM. Now, the other thing to keep in mind with the repository is it usually uses slightly more RAM during our synthetic operations to cache that for performance abilities. So it can use at the job level when we're doing a synthetic operation, it can use up to that 4 gigs of RAM. And that's a difference there you'll want to keep in mind is we have the task at a disk level, then on the repository, it does it at the disk level and at the job level, where a proxy is always going to be at the disk level within the VMs in the job. Now, if you have a single VM in the job, then that, and it only has a single disk, that will only take up 1 task. Now with the Veeam backup server, now you usually want to, the base install is about 4 gigs of RAM and 4 CPU cores, but then you want to have roughly about another 2 or 500 megabytes of RAM per job that it's managing. So you could have one centralized Veeam server and have 3 multiple other sites and expand them out and have the Veeam server relatively lightly, then putting most of the workload and everything on the repositories and proxies at those local locations. One other thing to keep in mind with a repository, if you're using a CIFS, a network share type of drive, in the settings, you'll see what we call a gateway server because we can't have the agent that does the write operations live directly on that machine. So we've broken it out to handle that at a local site as well. So this is where the proxy might be at one location and the repository is at another location. So we're communicating between 2 of our Veeam agents instead of trying to do a write through a network share drive. Now that's where you're going to use these allocations for these resources and not on the actual storage itself. So you can still manage it the same way and it's within the job configuration. So again, this really comes down to performance and how you're going to get out of it. If you see in your backup jobs you're running that your proxy's at 99% the bottleneck, that usually means you've probably over allocated it. And during this thing, we have a helpful little hint and tool there is when you have the proxy and you set the concurrent task, it automatically registers how many CPU cores we've recognized that machine to have. If you've over allocated, it'll give you that nasty little green or yellow triangle saying, hey, maybe you don't want to do this. I usually also recommend is adding 1, maybe 2 CPU cores overhead for the standard Windows operation to handle that machine and just let it go. We usually tend to recommend also your Veeam server or your proxy servers and everything else to keep them aligned with each other and kind of a standardized deployment, but not doing other things in your environment. So this is a workhorse for you. Don't install a proxy on a domain controller or something along those lines. Again, not a good idea in most cases. So with this, a very powerful thing that you can scale with this. And if you only need one, you can increase this. But also another thing to keep in mind is how many concurrent tasks you have, because once you've scaled this up, your network might not be able to keep up and actually handle that. So with this said, something to look into our best practices and really following, but make sure you've allocated your resources properly for the machines that you're planning on using. And on to here, Rick. Actually, this one's mine again. I apologize. So Veeam retention properties. So after now you've got your resources allocated properly for your proxies and repositories, well, what am I going to do and how is it going to fit on my repository that I have? So my best practices for this is going through, because a lot of times people come in and say, well, I'm running out of backups. I have no space left in my repository. I set it to 60 days of restore points, but I didn't really know if I'm going to have enough space or not, and understand what the current settings are. I use the automatic selection of the job. When we enable it, we use what we call a forward incremental job type with default. So if you don't change anything, very good selection, but it does use a little bit more space, and understanding that ahead of time will save you a headache or the time where you run out of space on your repository and you're having to make the hard choice of removing restore points or moving jobs around to do another full or copying large backup files. So we have a nice handy tool that's open source here and under the best practices. It's called the Restore Point Simulator. And I'll show you an example of this on the next slide here in just a second, but very powerful tool that we'll get into a little bit more. So the next one is knowing your backup sizes. So doing some testing, and there's a location in the Veeam server that you can see that it has a your actual data size prior to backup, then your actual backup data size, and then its compression and deduplication percentage ratios right there next to it. And that's under the backups disk location. And we're looking into our file types. This will also show you our different file types. Our VBK is our full backup file. VIB is our small local backup file. And then our forward incremental, sorry, the VRB is our reverse incremental, and the VBM file is our metadata file. So in the backups disk section, you're actually opening up that VBM metadata file to see all the things about that backup set and backup chain. Next one is using the right storage for the job. If you're going to use a backup copy job, a lot of times we don't recommend writing to a backup like a data domain maybe for the first storage, then trying to pull off of that deduplicated storage to another one. You want to move that data domain to the target side so you have a longer retention, then have a faster, quick storage for your daily restore operations, and maybe keep a smaller backup chain there. So organizing your storage in to use it for its best capabilities. Not saying that you could do it the other way, it would still work probably just fine, but it might increase your backup windows and performance. One other thing is not all full backups are the same. So there is a lot of differences between the synthetic full operation and the active full. And that comes down to snapshot time with your backup job. And then also the space required on the repository is usually roughly the same, but it's a lot of IOPS and the process of load during the backup job. With an active full, we're doing a full disk read, full disk write. For a synthetic full, we're doing a incremental read on the production machine, and then we switch over to the repository to do a commutative backup of the existing blocks to create the synthetic full backup. And if you use REFS or something like that, you can save a lot of space and time with that process. The last one here is the animated retention policy. Very strong KB article. This goes over and helps you put it in. I'm a visual learner. I really like to see this. This will actually go through and show you each one of our retention types. So we have what we call forever forward incremental, and reverse incremental. And this will actually go in and has a sub KB article for the backup copy job and how GFS works. That one's for another day, but it can help you grasp it, because that's one we would find trying to explain very often, because it is kind of slightly different in how it works. But again, something you can watch over and over again and get those ideas. And then if you still have questions, open a support case. They will be able to help you fill in those gaps in between. So again, understanding how Veeam works as its backup retention will get you that initial first step to really succeed in the future. And now on this next slide is the example of the restore point simulator. So with this is up on the top left, you'll see the quick presets. The quick presets, I have it set as an forward incremental with a weekly active full and 30 restore points. But then you look over on the right-hand side and you see there's actually 36 restore points, not 30. And you'll notice the way we word that in our backup job is restore points to keep on disk. We say that because we are saying, okay, I want to keep maybe not 30 days, and you can't automatically make that jump because if you run the job multiple times a day, then you might hit 30 restore points before 30 days. So always keep that in the back of your mind is how many restore points I want to keep on actual disk. And with this one, we're doing a single run once a day, and you can change the interval on these jobs as well for this tool. So it can show you how many restore points you're going to have at full retention. So knowing this will build all the way to 36 restore points because we're overbuilding a week so that when we purge per our retention after a successful job run, we will be back down at 30. So the job starts off, it builds all the way to 36 restore points. Then we delete the first week of backup restore points, and now we're back down at 30. Then we turn around and go from 30 back to 36, and so on. So we give you that extra reliability because we're taking a larger backup set and we're breaking it down into smaller weekly backup chains because our incrementals rely on the previous restore point before it. So in this example, the VBK at slot 1 is the restore points from 7 to 2 rely on that VBK. Then the next week and so on, we stack it kind of like an office building. So you have these multiple restore points, but then with this one, the one kind of caveat to this is the size and space allocation for this one. You can use this tool for that, and it will definitely make sure that you have enough space if you follow this, but it usually tends to over allocate. And sometimes people are like, well, this is too much. So what you can do is back to that backups dislocation is taking your time to plan this out and maybe in a test environment, or even if you are doing it in production, you've gotten to that point, is having a week's worth of backups, I say, is usually good. That means you have a full backup file, and then you have 5 to 6 incremental backup files, so you can find your average daily incremental restore point size. And that's might be different for different scheduling, but on this example. So with that data, I have the ability to then show is going with any number of restore points, I have the average of my incrementals and the size of my VBK, then it's just doing a simple multiplication of how with this tool is going, I have 36 restore points, I know I have 6 fulls and I have 30 incrementals, I multiply that out, that shows me right there how much from my existing true life field data, how much I could do on any retention that I set within my job. And then we always have the ability is, okay, is this going to be too much because I have multiple full backups? We have the forever forward incremental that will keep you 1 restore point VBK and then just incrementals stacked on top of it. So again, you have different options for your different situation, and that's something to play around with in each one. So again, this restore point calculator or simulator is very helpful, and along the lines with the KB article for the retention to understand how it works. It'll help you out, and again, along the way. And if you are ever scared about this, like I said, open a support case. They will gladly make sure that, okay, am I going to run out of storage space or anything else, to do a double check so you don't get stuck in that. So there we go.
Great, Travis. In fact, I argue an additional worst practice would be thinking that restore points equals days retained,
Yes.
right? This is a great way to visualize the extension, basically the math of how many restore points, what is the frequency of the job, etc. So that's a great tip. So thank you for that. And then we did have one question. Yeah, these slides are going to be made available to you. So I know that there are some links, some KBs referenced as well. You're going to get that via email. And the final tip is not having an air gap. That's the worst practice, of not having something that's offline or air gapped. And in today's ransomware era, some form of offline or air gap storage is the single most effective specimen to be resilient against ransomware. So my best practices definitely have something that's offline or air gapped. And this can be removable disk, it can be tape, it can be a number of different ways or combinations of that, by the way. But the thought here is that you might want to have a situation where maybe you have a couple of these in use. I realize everyone has a story of tape letting them down, but the reality is it still is very resilient. Replicated virtual machines, that's a great technique to introduce some offline and air gap of sorts. Okay, it's not completely air gapped, but it's offline and there's a completely different authentication framework. Same with primary storage snapshots. In fact, I had a great tip come out of the field one time. I was talking with an organization. Their backup storage was the old SAN. Okay, so how many times have you heard that? I'm using the old SAN as my backup target. They actually enabled snapshots on that. Like not very often, but like once a day. But the thought was if their backup repository was compromised, they had a storage snapshot on that they could leverage. That's in addition to virtual machines, right? So think about that. Cloud Connect is a great technique. In fact, that has a technology called insider protection. If you're not familiar with it, you can even run it yourself as an enterprise where a completely out of band copy of the backups are kept. And then rotating hard drives, right? Some of these technologies, both through hardware devices, through Veeam technology, and then just characteristics of how you implement it, can actually walk you into having some of the air gap or the offline elements that you would need to be resilient. Now, there's a number of resources. We've talked about a bunch of them, a couple KBs, a couple links to the simulator, the best practice guide, et cetera, et cetera. But if you like what you see, you might want to download a trial. And you can download a trial of Veeam Backup and Replication at the website, and it's fully functional. And there's also a free edition called Veeam Backup and Replication Community Edition. So up to 10 instances, you can back that up and have a lot of these extra protection techniques. In fact, I spoke to one person recently. They don't have the decision authority to make a change. They're actually backing up what they really care about with Community Edition because what they've already invested in for their backup solution wasn't working so good. So if you're in that situation, maybe give that a try. As you look through the rest of the year here at Veeam, the number of things coming, we're going to have some new capabilities around network attached storage, more recovery engines, more capabilities around the cloud and cloud tier, as well as more API capabilities. Hope this webinar has been effective for you guys today. Travis and I have done what I think a pretty good job of handling these questions as they've come in real time. But we will do a final call for questions here, and we will do our best here. So Thomas asks a question about the restore points. He'd like a feature where minimum days on disk. That's a great idea, Thomas. Almost like a hold retention engine ahead of the job. Start making noise on the forums about that. The Veeam forums, every post is reviewed by product management. That might be a good way to make something happen. Rafal asked, is NetApp supported? Well, we already do support NetApp. Yes, the slides are going to be emailed as well as a recording. And oh, I see what you're saying, Rafal. More as an integrated backup target. We don't have that so much. It's more on the production workload. Sonus asks, should I enable health checks while taking weekly full backups? There's nothing bad about doing extra integrity steps. If you have the time and cycles and designed right, I wouldn't see why not. All right, well, on behalf of myself, Travis, the global Veeam product team, and our marketing teams as well, I'd like to thank you for attending this webinar, and that concludes today's presentation. I'm done.
Okay, can you listen to this nice song this is?